Hi there. Today I'm going to be showing you how to use the Silkscreen and how to set it up. There'll be some photos and some stills and then also me doing the actual printmaking. I'm going to do the printmaking right now. Basically, the important thing to know is registration is critical. So what I have done is I have a board and I have taped on the edge the notion of the word screen, so I know where the screen is sitting. I have taped where the paper is supposed to go, which is what's happening here with this green tape here. And I've even put green tape so that you can see that there's a piece of clear acetate, and that is also in the right location based on the frame that I have in this area of my screen. Now the screen is an open screen, and what I've done is I've used clear packing tape on the entire thing to block out where I don't want the ink to go. It's important that your squeegee is just a little bit bigger than the space that you actually have in your opening. My opening is probably this much bigger, this much smaller than my squeegee. And so my squeegee is going to be right there. That's where it's going to live. I've got paper and I've got ink. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use several colors of ink. For every color of ink you're using, you need to make sure that you have a spatula for that ink. Okay, that's an important element. If you're using a different spatula for every ink, then you know that you're not actually going to be putting any ink, you're not going to be contaminating any ink. So I have 3 spatulas and I have 3 colors. And what I'm going to start with is called a flooded screen. A flooded screen is when you have an open screen, it doesn't have any image on it at all, it just has an opening. And what I'm going to do is I want to use a few different colors in here just to see if I can make it a little bit interesting. This is going to be a 3-color print in the end, 3 colors being 3 layers of ink. In this case, I'm using 3 colors just in this part, and what's going to happen is it's going to create a flooded screened area. Now, it's important to hold your squeegee so that it's on an angle, and the part that you're going to be pushing down is this edge here. So you're not actually bending the squeegee, you're just carrying it towards you. And you want to make sure that you are actually doing it quite tightly. And then you can tap the ink there. Now I don't actually have a lot of ink on here, so I'm going to put just a little bit more in here. And I'm going to just do that. Now I don't actually have to do this more than once. If you were going to be printing on a t-shirt, you'd be using a different type of squeegee. This is for paper. Not for fabric. This one is for fabric, and it's all about the fact that there's a warp and a weft in the fabric. In the paper, there's not. It's usually pretty flat. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a bucket to hold this up so that it doesn't do that. You can have a location for your squeegee that is not on the actual screen. I'm going to do that, put it over here. I have 2 other things that are important. I have a sponge for helping clean up and a dry cloth to helping clean up. And this can be for your hands or for the squeegee. So I'm going to, for the sake of the video, I'm going to actually put it all the way up. You tend to not do that because you don't want the ink to slide down. But what I have here is I have an image that is a section of my acetate. The other thing that has happened is I actually have a little bit of splooging or ink coming out right here, and I don't want it to come out and I don't want it to transfer anywhere else, so I'm wiping it up and getting rid of it. You need to be fairly fastidious about your cleanup because you don't want to have it going anywhere else. Now I'm making cards that are going to have a hand on them, and this is my background. You don't really want to have any ink going into your opening because it can splooge out and be in another area that you don't want. So basically what I'm doing is I'm squeegeeing it back and forth. I'm going to put this guy here. I'm going to lift this up. Your print is going to be attached to your screen, simply because the ink holds it in place. I'm going to just do a couple more because it is such a pain to set all this up and then actually have to clean it up. So I'm going to do another one. I'm lining up my paper to the registration points, and I've used 2 pieces of tape so that it really sits in there properly. I don't need to check it with the acetate because I know that it's in the right spot. I'm going to go back in with my squeegee, and I'm pushing it away from me this time. You want to make sure that there's no ink leaving there, so you're pushing quite firmly down. If you don't press down really firmly, what will happen is you'll have very, very thick ink and it'll take a long time. Now, I have a tiny little lighter area right here. What that is I did not have enough ink in this area, so I have to replace the amount of ink. And if you just keep rejuvenating it when you're flooding a screen, you can have some interesting things going on. You can also draw with a palette knife or with either a palette knife or a spatula. And so you're kind of creating some marks that might show up. But what will happen ideally is I still have to use the squeegee to take the ink completely away. So what will happen is those marks will then show up. And again, I normally don't pull this all the way off, but we've got some interesting marks in there through that. So you can spend quite a bit of time playing around with different colors and different notions within your ink. But you always want to make sure that you're lining it up properly. If you're using a different size piece of paper, then of course you would be checking it again to make sure that you've got the right edge around things. Generally, you want to try and have at least 1 inch all the way around. Because this is a card that is going to have a message inside, I don't want to have a whole inch all the way around. That's kind of a huge amount of space. But that's something to consider. So banging it helps get the ink off of the spatula, off of the squeegee. So another thing that can happen is I have a little bit of a splooge happening up at the top here. It's an uneven line, and it's partly because at the very top the ink had started to encroach onto the actual screen opening. So when something like that happens, there's a couple of strategies. One is taking the sponge and cleaning that off. Now, the thing is it's wet, so you don't really want it to be wet on your surface. So then you go ahead with your cloth to clean that. And then to just make sure that it's completely removed. And then you can go about your daily business of using the squeegee again. The couple things that you need to know about the squeegee too is when you're putting the ink on, you want to make sure that you're really removing it. If there's any extra ink on here, the problem is that it will transfer into the paper and it'll be really, really thick and take a long time to dry. So you don't want to have any little lines of ink in there. And if you're not sure you've got all of it on, for sure you can do it again. But every single time you do another layer of ink or another pass, it will actually get thicker and thicker each time. So don't do it like 16 times. That's just too many. 2 or 3 maybe. 2's ideal. 1's ideal, but that doesn't always happen. And so that's what happens with that. Now, I didn't dry really well, and so I have this little splooge here, which is really annoying. So if I knew I was going to make more, I would make sure that this is clean and dry and make sure that this is clean and dry. But, you know, there's no reason to be upset or worried. It just means that you need to use another piece of paper. All right, so I'm going to do one more. Hopefully it'll be perfect. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to take all the ink off that's left over so that you're not wasting the ink. Now, I know I'm almost out of ink here. I really don't want to take more ink out, but I have some little spaces in there. And so I'm going to go over it just until I have everything there. Now what I'm going to do is I have sort of a slush bucket that's just ink that's different colors. I don't ever throw any ink out. I try really hard to not put it down the sink. And so what I'm doing is I'm just scraping all the ink away off of my spatula, off of my squeegee, and off of the surface that is my screen. If you have used masking tape or clear packing tape, on your screen, the best way to remove it is to do it when you're cleaning your screen up. If you do it while it's still, it's completely dry, one of the issues with that is that you might wind up tearing the screen, especially if it's old. I have a really old screen here, so I am definitely not going to do that. And I'm not going to do that in this case. But taking all the ink off is the first thing that's really critical. I'm going to take off undo the hinges, remove it from this casing. And then the thing is that I do have some splooges in my area from the squeegee. I'm going to remove that because I really don't want to have any extra ink on here. And in fact, I do want to remove, much better. I do want to remove the ink from my acetate because I don't really want to have to take it off. And one of the things that you need to know about the acetate is when you're attaching it, you need to attach clear packing tape on this side and you need to attach clear packing tape on this side. And you don't want it to extend past the clear acetate and you don't want it to be too small. If it's a really small piece of tape, what will happen is this will wiggle and it won't help you with the registration. And registration is probably the $50 word for today. So what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of the image on the acetate. Because I'm using permanent ink that is acrylic ink, you can use fabric ink, you can use acrylic ink, and you can use water soluble. The problem with water soluble is if you're putting it on something like a t-shirt, it will wash out. Acrylic is a beautiful medium, as is the fabric ink. The challenge is that you're using a silkscreen, which is fabric. So you need to use cold water, and if it doesn't come out, you're going to use Mr. Clean to spritz it. It's really important to get all the way around the edge and to clean both sides and to take the tape off because the tape will trap the actual ink inside there and you don't want it to do that. So when you're ready to do a second layer, I'm going to be using things I've just finished making. I've waited for it to dry. The test is to put your hand on it. If you don't stick to it, then it's ready to be used as another printing layer. If you do stick to it, you have to wait because the thing is it's going to stick to here and it might transfer this ink onto your background, the back of your screen, and then it will transfer into other areas. So it's a really good idea to not do it when it's wet. And so then what I'm going to do is I've set up my area again with my paper registration and my acetate, but I'm going to check it this time because I'm not 100% sure if it's right. What I've done is I've attached a piece of acetate to this that has an opening that looks like a hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one piece of paper underneath my acetate to just make sure it's in the right spot. I used a yellow and two other yellows in my first layer. Because I want everything to kind of work together in all three layers, I'm using this yellow and I'm also using this blue to make this green. And then my final color is going to be a straight blue or blue with a little bit of black added to it. So I've masked off all the way around and I've taped my acetate to the underside of the screen. So the acetate, when you're using a cut film stencil cut, it has to be underneath. If it was on top, what would happen is when you're using the squeegee, it would rip the screen and wouldn't rip the screen, but it would rip the acetate. So I've made a fair amount of this color. I'm placing it at the top of my screen. The image is not that much smaller than what my very first layer, which was the flooded screen, was. And so I still have to utilize the same squeegee. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do one pass because it's sitting on top of the acetate and I don't want to do 6 layers on that. I just want to do one. So I'm doing one on that. And this is going to live over here so that it is not going to fall down. And here's my image, and I'm pretty happy with the location actually of where it will be on my page. If I didn't like it, what I could do is I could lower my taped area and move it down just a little bit so that it in fact is in a better spot. But I was pretty careful with where I put it, and I'm very happy with where it's sitting. So that means I don't necessarily need my acetate anymore. If for whatever reason you're not sure you're getting a good, you're not being very careful with your registration, you can use your acetate every time to check. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push this ink back and forth. Now the challenge with using acetate is it will jump a little bit on the side because the acetate is thick, it has a thickness. So it's really important to be really quite strong with pushing the ink down. And so there we go. So I have my print, I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm going to go ahead and do a whole pile of these. And I'm going to try and do the same method every time. Now sometimes the acetate, if it's got little floaters in it, they might come off. That's another reason to make sure that your ink underneath is dry. Okay, so if you get some movement, which is what I had here, I'm going to carefully make sure that I do not have any ink. Sometimes the ink will bleed onto your acetate, and you don't want to have that happen. And you want to make sure that it's really clean. I have one print that didn't work out because I didn't wipe properly, so I'm going to use that one as my tester. So never throw them away because you might wind up using it as a tester for things that didn't work out. And the other thing that can happen is if it really feels like your squeegee is having a hard time moving, it might be because you do not have enough ink. So I tend to put out more than I need, specifically so that I have an easier time of the squeegee moving. So the squeegee needs to have quite a bit of ink on it for it to actually shift from one side to another. And so if it really feels like it's skidding or sticking, the odds are it's because of that. So I've corrected that problem, and I can continue on with the rest of my prints. I want this one to be a little bit more blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take all of this green off, because I don't really want it to be completely green. I want to actually see if I can make it a little bit more blue. And so I'm also taking off all the excess ink on this. I'm not going to bother to clean it. I'm just going to take off as much excess as I can. And for this last print, what I'm going to do is use a new spatula and this blue. And I'm only going to make one, so I don't necessarily need a lot of ink out. So this is not going to be as blue as the blue that was there, but it's also not really green. So it does change the color a little bit, but it is something to consider if you wanted to play around with the color. It's important to know that you're going to be washing all of the tools that are a part of that setup. So the squeegees, the spatulas, the screen for sure, but the other critical piece is the piece of acetate and if the acetate transferred any ink anywhere else. So I'm wiping this down first, only because if it dries, then it'll be much harder to remove. All right, so I'm getting rid of that. And, you know, I am going to take off my acetate piece just so that you can see what it looks like. You technically don't have to tape it down, but the thing that's nice about taping it down is then you know it's not going to flap at all, because sometimes it can do that. So I set it up, figured out where it went, taped it down, but this acetate I'm going to keep, and I can keep it forever. I can use it again and again and again. And the rest of this I then have to wash. And so, you know, you're taking all of your pieces with you to the sink to wash up, and you're also washing up or cleaning up your counter space too, your working space, so that you don't have any ink for the next time. Okay, so now we're doing the third color. And the challenge is that it has to register perfectly with the hand that's here. And the hand that I've got going on here is a very thin outline. So, just to recap, it's critical to have a piece of acetate, especially for this particular aspect. It needs to be taped down really well both ways, here and here, so it doesn't move. And in fact, I'm just realizing I don't have more tape here. I had to move the entire section because this particular screen is an emulsion screen that I have with an image on it, and it is lower down. So I had to take this off and move it. So now I have it on both ways so that it can't pull or shift at all. Really critical piece. This is the thing that will save you. I have not laid out where my tape lines are going to go for my paper because I haven't figured out where this is in relationship to everything else. So what I'm going to do is I have two colors. I have a blue and a black. I'm going to do a little bit of a mix. And I don't have that many prints. I've got like 12 prints, but I want to make sure I have enough. So I'm putting, and it's predominantly blue. Because it's like 90% filled in and it's a really thin line, I don't need that much ink. But you'll notice I'm using two spatulas for the primary source ink, and now I'm using another spatula, a Scotty knife, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these two colors together. I want it to be really dark. It's important to have different values for each of your layers and to make sure that they're very different in value. So you don't want them all to be sort of a 20% value because then you won't be able to see or discern them. So I had a 20% orange to begin with, and then I moved into sort of a 50 or 60% green, and now I'm doing sort of an 85% blue-black. Okay, and I'm just really mixing it up. I want it to be a really nice, solid color. I mean, to be fair, I maybe should just be using straight black, so I might try it with this, and it might be that I decide I need to go straight black. I can do that. I can move from one value to another, but you need to move up in values. So a 0 to a 10 to a 20 to a 50 to a 60 to a 100. Okay, and I'm just going to make one pass. And this is specifically so that my acetate has a version of it. And it's way too low, all right? So what I want to do is, I'm not going to use a blank piece of paper because that doesn't tell me where the registration is. I'm going to use a colored piece of paper. And I'm going to start with the first one I did, not the last one I did, because they're still a little bit sticky. And that test again to see, is it dry? It's not quite sticking to me for the first one I did. And now what I'm doing is I'm just lining it up as accurately as I can. And hopefully you've made it so that there is not too much overlap. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an area for where my paper should be approximately going, but it's not going to be the only thing I'm using as my notion. I am going to be using my acetate much more with every single one of these, because of course if anything had moved while I was printing, it could become a real issue. Okay, so I'm just taking my ink and moving it down. And for this one, this screen is much looser in tension, so I shouldn't ever have my ink at this end. I should always have it at the bottom. So I'm really hoping that this first pass is pretty good. Yeah, now I have a whole bunch of dots down at the bottom here, which I don't want. And that is from making the emulsion. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some tape to just block off that bit. So I didn't like what was going on there, and I didn't like what was going on at this end. And just to be safe, I'm going to do another one. So whenever you have something that's bleeding through and you don't like, that's what the masking tape is for. The masking tape is also a good thing to use to hold your screen up so that you don't have it all the way up, because you can see my ink is sliding down. I do like the value shift that's happening in here, and so I don't think I'm going to change my ink. I do like the orange and the blue optically hitting each other because they're color opposites. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my first prints and not using my last prints first. I'm going to use them last. And I'm using this to just make sure it's in a good spot, and my registration was bang on, so that's great. And now I'm going to just make a whole bunch of these. Good idea to make sure your ink is not super runny. Older ink is definitely better. Make sure that your screen is clean and tight. Make sure that you've masked off the areas that you don't want to have printed, and to make sure that your second color or your third color that you're working on is really completely dry. If it's at all wet, you're just going to run into problems, which is what I'm having issues with. I'm going to be putting my third color on these. They finally had a chance to dry. And because I'm going to be using some gold, I'm also going to try using black paper and see what that looks like. And I can't remember exactly where it is on my screen. So I've tightened my my screws so that they're really tight and the screen is not moving. I have taped up all the areas that I'm not using on my screen. I have taped up where I think the paper should go in a registration down here. And I've also taped up my acetate in this on both sides to make sure that it doesn't move all the way across. Because I want to make sure I'm testing the right consistency and the right color and the registration, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do it on the acetate first. Now, because I'm using gold, it's really, really runny, and I'm a bit concerned that it's going to bleed around and move around too much. So I'm putting some gold paint ink on. And then the other thing I'm using is called an acrylic base, which is a Silkscreen additive. And what it's going to do, hopefully, is make it just a little bit thicker so it's not so runny. And so I'm just going to mix that up, and I'm mixing it right on my screen. And whatever I don't use, I'm actually going to just put back into the gold ink, mostly because it's not really changing the color, it's just changing the thickness. So it's much thicker, it's not quite as runny as what it was a minute ago. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm always using my squeegee. I can have it going away from me and I can have it going towards me. I prefer it going towards me, but the thing is I don't really want the ink to wind up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to scrape it up, and I'm really putting it down hard. I'm going to put my squeegee right there so that it's not here moving. And I have a pretty good registration. It's not exactly right to the page, so I'm actually going to use that as a guide, but I'm going to be using my acetate more than I'm going to be using the paper, the tape area that I've created to say the registration. And now I can do it again. And because the additive, I don't think it should change the nature of the ink too much, but I am just doing it more than once because it's a top coat and it's gold, and gold tends to be a little transparent. So it's not bad. It looks pretty good on a dark surface. I don't think it's going to look that great on the light green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try doing it on black and see what that's like. The registration for this, because there's not actually, because I don't actually have any other layers with it, it doesn't really matter as much where the location is, but I do like getting them in the same spot every time. So I am just doing that. So if you have a splooge that you don't like, you can use the tape to just block that off. That's better than actually using water and a sponge and then drying it off, because it's quicker, but it's also because you don't want it to get wet. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, I know that this green is not going to show the gold to the best advantage. I think that it won't be enough contrast because it's so transparent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the acetate down. I'm going to scrape off all of the gold ink. I started with the lightest color. So one of the ways of being really efficient about this project in terms of silk screening is you should be using lots of different colors, but you should be doing it in an efficient way. So always start with your lightest color and then go in with a darker color later. So I want to use straight blue. Again, it's really runny. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a bit of this gel medium on, and I'm going to use a little bit of blue. And I don't think yesterday I was making it a little bit darker. I don't think I want to make it darker this time. I think I want it to be actually pretty true blue. I do want to mix it up though. Now I have a bunch of gold on my squeegee, so I'm going to take that off. And I'm going to use my gold spatula. So for every color you're using, you should have a separate spatula. So I have 3 spatulas, one for the gold, one for the mix, and one for the blue. I'm just mixing it up. You don't need to have a whole container to mix. You just have to make sure you're not doing any of your mixing directly on the surface where your opening is, because it'll bleed through and it'll create a huge mess. So now I just have to make sure that it's registered correctly, because this is the 3rd color. And I mean, okay, the first color was just a rectangle. It wasn't that big a deal. But hand 1 and hand 2 do need to meet up. I really want them to register just right. The first thing you're going to do is clean off your acetate, because it can dry fairly quickly. I have a sponge that's wet and I have a cloth that's dry. And I'm just making sure that everything I've done that was messy is now cleaned up in that part of it. Then the other aspect is that I have a lot of ink left over on here. And it's not that different from the ink that's here. If it's a really different color, I would say don't put it back in the container. But if it's pretty much not changed from what you'd put it in, then you would just use a spatula and put it all back in. And then the things you have to wash are your spatulas, your screen, and your squeegee. And then wherever your squeegee made marks on the board, that's the other thing that you have to clean up. And it's good to kind of get that stuff cleaned up before you leave, because it takes a while to wash all of these things and you don't want it to dry. Then I wind up taking the sponge with me. I take the board with me. And the rest of my area is now clean and ready to go for the next step, whatever the next step is. So cleaning up is using cold water, not hot water, because you don't want the acrylic paint or ink to adhere to the fabric. And you wash everything up and you should be good to go for the next round as soon as the next round is dry. So good luck and enjoy trying to register with acetate and tape. And remember to use your squeegee in a really hard manner so that you're really making it nice and dense and thin to each layer so that it will dry quickly.